The words were still in the air when I felt something shift inside me. Not a crack, not a break, something more like a door, swinging slowly open. My son-in-law had just looked at me across my own kitchen table and said, "My mother would never let a house get like this. She actually takes pride in her home." My daughter sat beside him and said nothing. I set down my coffee cup. I looked at him, and then I said the thing I had been holding back for 11 months, 3 weeks, and what felt like 1,000 small surrenders. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's not where this story begins. It begins the way most things like this begin, with love. With a mother who would do anything for her child, with a yes that I gave too easily, too quickly, before I understood what I was really agreeing to. My husband passed in February of last year. Pneumonia, which turned into complications, which turned into a phone call at 4 inches the morning, that I still reach for him after sometimes, in that first gray moment, before I'm fully awake. We had been married for 39 years. He built the bookshelves in the living room. He planted the rose bush by the front walk. He called me every day at noon when he was at work, just to hear my voice. After he was gone, the house was very quiet. My daughter called every few days. She lived about 40 minutes away with her husband, and they had been renting a townhouse there for 3 years. She was 34, he was 37. They didn't have children yet, though she had mentioned wanting them. I had always liked the idea of grandchildren in this house. It felt like something the walls were waiting for. In May, 4 months after I buried her father, she called and asked if they could stay with me for a little while. Her husband's company had downsized. The lease on the townhouse was up at the end of the month. They needed somewhere to land while he looked for work and while they figured out what came next. I said yes before she finished the sentence. I said yes because she was my daughter and she needed me. I said yes because the house was quiet and I was lonely in a way that sits behind the sternum. I said yes because her father would have said yes, and saying yes felt like honoring something of his. I told her to take the guest suite at the end of the hall. It had its own bathroom and 2 good windows that faced the backyard. I moved some boxes from the closet in there and put fresh towels on the rack. I bought new pillows. I was, genuinely, happy to do it. They moved in on a Saturday in late May. My daughter hugged me in the driveway and said, "Mom, thank you. I promise we won't be any trouble." Her husband carried boxes past me without making eye contact. I told myself he was just stressed about the job situation. I told myself he was the kind of person who needed time to warm up. I was good at telling myself things like that back then. The first few weeks were fine, mostly. My daughter helped with the grocery shopping. She sat with me in the evenings sometimes, and we watched television together, the way we used to when she was in high school and her father worked late. Those nights felt good. They felt like something being mended. Her husband spent most of his time in the room they were using, on his laptop, or on calls in the backyard. He said he was networking, reaching out to contacts, building something. I didn't ask too many questions. It wasn't my business. I made extra at dinner and knocked on their door, and sometimes he came down and sometimes he didn't. The first thing I noticed was the garage. I have a 2-car garage. After my husband died, I parked my car on one side and kept the other side organized, his tools, some holiday storage, the lawn equipment. I had left it mostly the way he'd arranged it because I wasn't ready to change it. One afternoon in June, I went out to get the garden hose, and half the shelving had been moved. Boxes I didn't recognize were stacked along the wall. A folding table had been set up with some equipment on it, electronics, cords, things I didn't know the names of. I asked my daughter about it that evening. She said her husband was starting a small resale business and needed a workspace. She said he had mentioned it to me. He had not mentioned it to me. I let it go. That was the first of many things I let go. I kept a kind of running tally in the back of my mind, without meaning, to a list of small moments I filed away and didn't speak about, because I didn't want to cause tension, because I was raised to keep the peace, because my daughter's face when she talked about her husband had something fragile in it that I didn't want to disturb. In July, he started having people over. Not a party. Nothing dramatic. Just 2 or 3 men at a time, in the garage, sometimes spilling out onto the back patio. I'd come home from the grocery store and find strangers in my backyard drinking my husband's brand of beer. the one I still bought without thinking about it. I'd smile and introduce myself in my own home. I'd go inside and put the groceries away and listen to the noise coming through the back door. Once I came downstairs at 11:30 at night because I couldn't sleep, and there were 4 men I had never seen sitting in my living room. The television was on, loud. Someone had moved my reading chair. I found my daughter in the kitchen, and I asked, quietly, if we could talk about the boundaries around having guests over, especially late on weeknights. She said, "Mom, he's trying to build a business. He needs to meet with people." I said, "I understand that. I just think it would be considerate to give me some notice when people are coming into the house." She looked at me the way I used to look at my own mother, sometimes impatient, a little guilty, a little defensive. She said she would mention it to him. He came into the kitchen a few minutes later and got a glass of water and didn't say anything to me at all. The men stayed until after midnight. September came, and with it a kind of creep that I can only describe as slow replacement. The pantry I had organized was reorganized, not badly, just differently, and without asking. A shelf in the linen closet had been cleared and refilled with things I didn't recognize. My husband's chair in the den, a big armchair he'd had since before we were married, brown leather, worn soft in the back, was moved to the corner and replaced in its usual spot with a different chair, one they had brought from the townhouse. I moved my husband's chair back. The next day, it was in the corner again. I stood in the doorway of the den for a long time that afternoon. I didn't touch the chair. I just looked at it. I had given everything I had to this house. 39 years of Christmases and summer dinners and sick children and repainted walls and scraped together savings and a husband who built bookshelves because we couldn't afford to buy them. This house was not just walls. It was not just square footage. It was evidence of a life. And someone was quietly, casually, reorganizing it around me. I tried once more to talk to my daughter. I asked her to sit with me at the kitchen table, just the 2 of us, a Sunday morning in October. I had made coffee. I had thought about what I wanted to say, the way I always do when something matters to me. I told her I was feeling a little displaced in my own home. I used that word carefully. Displaced. Not blamed, not accused, just named the feeling. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mom, I think you're still grieving, and I wonder if maybe the changes feel bigger than they are because of that." I looked at my daughter and I thought about the woman I had raised. I thought about the girl who had cried on my shoulder the night her first real heartbreak ended, who had called me from college at 2 inches the morning just to talk, who had stood next to me at her father's grave and held my hand so tightly I could feel the bones of her fingers. I said, "Maybe you're right," and I went back upstairs and I cried, very quietly, with the door closed. The thing about grief is that people use it against you without meaning to. They hand it back to you as an explanation for your own clarity. You see something clearly, you name it plainly, and someone says kindly, even lovingly, that maybe you're just sad, and you start to wonder if that's true. You start to doubt the evidence of your own eyes and the sound judgment you've been exercising for 63 years. I doubted myself all through October. In November, he criticized my cooking for the first time, openly. I had made pot roast, the way I always make it, with carrots and onions and a little red wine, the recipe I had learned from my own mother and made for my children every winter of their childhoods. My daughter had asked for it specifically. I had spent most of the afternoon on it. He cut into it, chewed, and said, "This is a little dry. My mother does something with the broth that keeps it more tender." My daughter didn't look up from her plate. I said, "I'll keep that in mind." And I excused myself before dessert. I sat in my bedroom and I told myself it was a small thing. I told myself he was thoughtless, not cruel. I told myself that some people simply do not think before they speak, and it wasn't worth a confrontation. But here is what I've come to understand about small things. They are not small. They are measurements. Every one of them measures something about how much space you are allowed to take up in your own life. And when you let them go without naming them, you are not keeping the peace. You are slowly, quietly handing over the deed. December arrived, and with it, the question of the holidays. I had always hosted Christmas. My children had grown up with Christmas in this house, the same tree in the same corner, The same ornaments, the handmade ones my daughter had brought home from kindergarten, still hanging near the bottom, where she had always put them as a child. My son drove in from Ohio every year with his family. My grandchildren knew where to find the cookies and which cabinet held the mugs for cocoa. In the first week of December, my son-in-law announced, not asked, that his family would be coming for Christmas. His parents, his brother, and sister-in-law. 3 additional people, staying for 4 days. He said it the way someone says a thing that has already been decided. I looked at my daughter. She looked at her coffee. I said, carefully, that I would need to think about capacity in the house and whether the timing worked. He said, they've already booked their flights. I said, I wasn't consulted about that. He said, I thought you'd want the house full for the holidays. I was trying to do something nice. I thought about my son arriving from Ohio. I thought about my grandchildren. I thought about the handmade kindergarten ornaments and the mugs for cocoa. I thought about Christmas in this house, which was built on 39 years of my own labor and love, and which now apparently had a new event coordinator who had not thought to ask me before booking flights. I said, I'd appreciate being included in those decisions before they're made final. He shrugged. He actually shrugged. And then he said, I mean, it's not like we're paying rent. I figured you'd be glad to have people around. It's not like we're paying rent. I filed that sentence away. I pressed it flat and put it somewhere quiet. And I moved through the rest of the conversation as if I hadn't just heard the whole truth of things laid out plainly. Christmas was complicated. His family was polite enough, mostly. His mother complimented the house in a way that sounded like she was complimenting herself for raising a son who had found a place like this to land. I smiled and offered more wine and filled plates and made myself useful in the way that women my age were taught to make themselves useful, which is to say, constantly and invisibly. On Christmas Eve, I found my husband's chair in the garage, not roughly treated, just moved. Apparently there hadn't been enough seating in the den, and someone had decided the old leather chair could go out. I went back inside. I stood in the hallway. I could hear voices and music and laughter from the living room. I could hear my grandchildren running on the stairs. I thought about my husband, who was not here to be moved to the garage himself, but whose presence lived in every corner of this house and was apparently no longer enough to keep things where they belonged. I thought about the woman I used to be before I became so careful, before I learned to file things away and let things go and wonder if I was maybe just sad. I went to the living room doorway and I looked at my son-in-law, sitting in my husband's chair, which had been brought back in from the garage and placed in its corner, and I made myself a promise. January was quiet. They stayed. There was no talk of a timeline. His business was gaining traction, that was the phrase. My daughter had taken a remote job, which helped, though she seemed to spend most of her energy managing her husband's moods rather than anything else. I watched her the way you watch someone you love moving through weather, hoping it clears. I started to wonder if my daughter was happy. I started to notice things: the way she laughed a half-second too late at his jokes, the way she deferred to him in small public moments that didn't require deference, the way she looked at me sometimes with an expression I recognized because I had worn it myself a long time ago. It was the expression of a woman who was managing something, working to keep the temperature in the room at a livable number. I thought about saying something. I thought about it many times. But I also knew that you cannot tell a woman something she is not yet ready to hear. I had learned that from my own life. You can only make sure she knows the door is open. February came. 1 year since my husband. I woke up on the anniversary and lay in the bed we had shared and looked at the ceiling and let myself grieve fully, the way I rarely let myself do anymore with other people in the house. Then I got up. I made coffee. I sat at my kitchen table in the morning light, and I thought about who I was before grief had made me small and careful. I thought about the woman my husband had loved, the one who had opinions and nerve and a laugh that he said he could hear from the next room. I thought about her, and I missed her the way you miss someone you used to know. That morning, I called my son in Ohio. I told him, carefully and in full, what the last 9 months had been. He listened, without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "Mom, why didn't you tell me sooner?" I said I wasn't sure I had understood it fully until I said it out loud. He said he was going to come for a visit. I asked him not to make it a confrontation. He said he would just come to see me. I said, "Okay, just come to see me." He came the last weekend of February. It was good to have him in the house. He fixed the hinge on the back door that had been sticking for months, and he sat with me in the evenings and we talked about his father and about the kids and about the kind of nothing in particular that people who love each other talk about when they're just glad to be in the same room. My son-in-law was polite to him in the way that people are polite when they know they are being observed. On Sunday morning, my son put his bag in the car and stood in the driveway with me. He said, "You know you can always come to us. You can stay as long as you want." I said I knew that. He said, "You also know this is your house, right?" I said I knew that too. I was just remembering it. He hugged me and drove back to Ohio, and I stood in the driveway for a minute in the February cold, looking at the rose bush my husband had planted, which would bloom again in a few months. Then I went inside. That afternoon I went to the den and I moved my husband's chair back to its place. This time, I didn't move it again, no matter what. March came mild. Some afternoons I sat on the back patio with a book and let the sun work its slow warmth back into my bones. My daughter came out sometimes and sat with me, and there were moments between us that were almost like before, easy and familiar. The particular comfort of a mother and a daughter who have known each other a long time. But the house still didn't feel like mine, and I had started to do the math, not out of bitterness. I want to be clear about that. I did the math because I am a practical woman, and I needed to see the shape of the thing plainly. The guest suite they occupied rented in this neighborhood for between $1,400 and $1,600 a month. They had been here for 10 months. My utility bills had increased significantly with 2 additional people in the house. My grocery bill was nearly double. I had repaired the garage door mechanism after it broke from overuse. I had replaced the bathroom towels twice. I had quietly absorbed all of it without a word. I was not running a hotel. I was not running a charity. I was a 63-year-old widow who had opened her home out of love, and love had been mistaken for a lack of conditions. I decided that the next time he made me feel small in my own home, I was not going to file it away. I was going to say the thing I should have said months ago. I was going to say it calmly and clearly, and I was going to mean every word. I didn't have to wait long. It was a Tuesday morning in mid-March. I had cleaned the kitchen the night before, and by morning, it was messy again in a way I had come to recognize dishes left to soak that would stay soaking indefinitely. The counter around the coffee maker ringed and sticky. Something spilled near the stove that had been left for later. I cleaned it again, quietly, because I could not function in a messy kitchen, and because no one else was going to do it. My son-in-law came downstairs around 9:30. He poured himself coffee. He looked around the kitchen with an expression I had come to know, well, not quite critical, not quite satisfied, the expression of a man who has decided his standards are the relevant ones. He said, "This place always feels a little cluttered to me. Like the counters. My mother keeps her counters completely clear. Nothing on them. It makes the whole kitchen feel bigger." My daughter had come downstairs behind him. She was looking at her phone. I turned from the sink. I looked at him. I looked at my daughter, who did not look up, and something in me went very still and very clear. I said, "I'm glad your mother keeps a kitchen you admire." He said, "I'm just saying, it's a style thing. She's got a real eye for space. Honestly, she'd probably have some good suggestions for the whole house if she came to visit." I said, "Your mother is welcome to visit." He smiled, like the subject was closed, like the conversation had gone the way he expected it to. And then I said, "And when she does, she's welcome to stay in her own hotel room, because as of the 1st of next month, I'll be needing this suite back." He looked at me. I said, "I've appreciated having you here. It's been 11 months, and I think that's been long enough for you both to get stable. I'd like 60 days' notice to be respectful, so let's call it the 1st of June." He said, "What?" I said, "I've also calculated what a fair market rental for the suite would have been, and I'm not asking for any of that back. Consider it my gift. But going forward, this house is mine, and I'll be living in it on my own terms. My daughter had put down her phone. He said, "You're being serious right now." I said, "I have never been more serious in my life." He said, "After everything we've done to help around here." I said, "I'd love to compare lists." He looked at my daughter. She looked at me, and in her face I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time. Something behind the eyes, something shifting, like a recognition. He pushed back from the counter and took his coffee upstairs without another word. My daughter and I stood in the kitchen. The morning light came in through the window the way it always does, slant and golden on the edge of the wood floor. The house was quiet. She said, "Mom." I said, "I love you. You know that." She said, "I know." I said, "And I need you to think about some things, about what you want, not what's convenient, not what's already been decided, what you actually want." She was quiet for a long time, long enough that I went to the cabinet and got down 2 mugs and poured us both more coffee and set hers across the table. She sat down. We didn't fix anything that morning. That's not how it works. There were no neat resolutions, no tearful admissions, no sudden clarity from the person who had been causing harm. He spent most of that day upstairs. She spent it quiet, thinking, but something had changed. Something in the architecture of the house had shifted back. I went out to the back patio in the afternoon and looked at the yard. The rosebush was beginning to show its first small buds, tight and pale against the bare branches. Another few weeks, and they'd be open. My husband had planted it the second spring after we moved in because I had mentioned once that I liked roses. He hadn't made a big thing of it. He'd just planted the bush. I thought about him the way I've learned to think about him now, not with the raw weight of the first months, but with something gentler. Gratitude, mostly. For the fact that he existed, for the 39 years, for the rosebush and the bookshelves and the noon phone calls, for showing me, by example, what it looked like to love someone without making them smaller. The following weeks were not easy. There were tense dinners and careful conversations, and at least one evening when I could hear a heated discussion behind their door that I walked past without slowing down. I held steady. I was kind without being soft. I was clear without being cruel. My son called twice a week during that period. He said I sounded like myself again. I told him I was working on that. My daughter came to me one evening near the end of March and sat in the kitchen while I was making dinner and said, without preamble, "I've been thinking about what you said, about what I want." I kept chopping. She said, "I don't think I've been very fair to you." I put down the knife. I turned to look at her. I said, "I don't need you to apologize to me. I need you to take care of yourself." She said, "Those might be the same thing right now." I looked at my daughter, this woman who had my eyes and her father's chin, and a laugh I had been hearing since she was 3 years old, and I felt the complicated fullness of loving someone who has let you down and whom you love anyway, without reservation. I opened my arms and she came across the kitchen and we stood there for a while. In April, they found a rental. A small apartment about 30 minutes away. He had gotten a part-time role with a company that seemed real and stable. She seemed lighter, or beginning to be. They moved out on a Saturday, the way they had moved in, though with a different feeling. She hugged me in the driveway and held on for a long time. He shook my hand and said, with something that might have been the beginning of humility, that he knew things hadn't gone perfectly. I said, "Fresh start." He nodded. I stood in the driveway and watched them drive away. Then I went back inside. The house was quiet. I walked through it slowly, room to room. I put my husband's chair back in its proper place. I cleared the shelves in the linen closet back to the way I kept them. I went out to the garage and I reorganized it, putting things where they belonged, and I ran my hand along the edge of his workbench and let myself feel his absence and his presence at the same time, the way they exist together now. I made myself a simple dinner. I ate it at my kitchen table, looking out at the yard. That evening, I sat in the living room in the last of the daylight with a book I had been meaning to read for months. In my house, which smelled like mine again and felt like mine again, and was mine, had always been mine, and I let the quiet settle around me like something I had earned. I am 63 years old. I know now that love without limits is not kindness. It is an invitation for the wrong kind of people to walk through doors you should have been guarding. I know that grief can make you porous, and that some people, not out of malice, maybe, but out of their own carelessness, will move right into that porousness and arrange themselves like furniture. I know that you can love your child completely and still require that the people she brings into your life treat you with basic dignity. I know that a woman who built something for 4 decades does not owe anyone the slow erasure of herself. And I know that some mornings you just sit in your chair, in your house, in the sun, and the roses are about to bloom. And something your husband planted is still growing, and you are still here, still whole, still entirely yourself. That is enough. That is more than enough.